Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aim Sin Peng, and I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney, but also the member of the Center for International Security Studies. I'm hosting today our first Info Security Global Forum webinar that will be on the topic of foreign interference and information operations in the Asia Pacific. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, for past, present, and emerging leaders. Today, we have four speakers who would be sharing their expertise with us regarding a very important issue that has emerged in the past few years, but also an important issue when it comes to research on the issue of information operations in the Asia Pacific region. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Frank Smith, who is the director of the Cyber and Innovation Policy Institute, part of the Strategic and Operational Research Department in the Center for Naval Warfare Studies at the U.S. Naval War College. I would like to welcome Frank back in particular because he used to be a member, a very important active member of the CIS here in Sydney. So thank you, Frank, for tuning in at such a very late evening time for you. Then we have Dr. Gulisar Hasiyakupoglu, who is a research fellow at the Center of Excellence for National Security at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University, based in Singapore. Welcome, Gulisar. And then we have Mark Manantan, who's a senior fellow at the Pacific Forum. And lastly, we have Anastasia Kapitas, who's the National Security Editor of the Strategist at ASPE. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So the first question I'd like to open the webinar with is for you to consider what are some of the biggest threats to the Asia Pacific region when it comes to information operations and foreign interferences in your view? We'll start first with you, Frank.
Thanks, Aim, and thank you all for your time. I have to start out by giving a disclosure that my ideas and comments today are my own and not positions of the U.S. Naval War College, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. In terms of the biggest threats facing the region, I think of a relatively potent combination of large populations that are potentially vulnerable to information and influence operations, combined with powerful external actors to those populations who are really playing for high stakes. The United States is, of course, one of those actors, but I think the U.S. military has a hard time thinking about competition below the threshold of armed conflict. So for better and often for worse, bullets and bombs we get. But short of physical violence, influence and competition in the marketplace of ideas, it's really harder for the U.S. military to understand and play a more constructive part in. Now, thinking about offense, cultivated ignorance may be okay. As democracies, we can be forgiven for not wanting our military and intelligence agencies to be particularly competent at psychological operations. But defense is a different story. And I think failure to understand the influence of potential competitors and adversaries is potentially dangerous, but so is the failure to understand our own susceptibility to these operations and the susceptibility of our friends and allies in the region. I don't think these failures are inevitable, but understanding and counteracting our own vulnerabilities in information environments is definitely outside our comfort zone.
What about Australia, Anastasia?
I think from an Australian perspective, and I don't want to speak from a government perspective because I think there are a whole bunch of different views here. But from my perspective, there are three things that we're really missing in terms of looking at the information picture. One is the rise of influence for hire. So this is a whole industry, a whole PR industry that works throughout the Asia-Pacific region, the Indo-Pacific region, whatever you would like to call it, to essentially manipulate publics. And the people that use these services are, anti-democratic actors. And when they use, part of this ecosystem is actually highly destabilizing for states, for polities. And everywhere we've seen, the use of disinformation, we see a state that has a lot of all their security issues, both domestically and potentially externally, exacerbated. So I think we really need to focus in on not just government actors, but this entire ecosystem that supports disinformation politics, essentially, and propaganda and influence operations. That's one thing. I think the other thing that we don't think enough about as states is supporting quality public interest journalism everywhere in the region. That is just incredibly critical. Of course, we all know that disinformation works by epistemological destabilization. That is conveying the idea to populations that nothing is true. Russia does this very well. If you look at propaganda channels in Russia, they're kind of saying to their audience, and we know that what we're doing is propaganda, but everybody is doing propaganda. There is nothing outside propaganda. And this is an incredibly destructive idea for both, public mental health, but also democracy and any kind of functioning of a society. So I think that's something that we need to think about very, very carefully. I think the other thing that we often miss, and colleagues of mine at ASPI have done really great work on this, is the use of big data by actors like China, who are just hoovering up data all over the region, all kinds of data. And one of the reasons they're doing that is to essentially be able to, in their own communications and disinformation and propaganda, be able to shape, able to manipulate global publics better. And this is a self-described aim of China, and they call it different things. They call it things like international social management. This is the idea from China of, number one, of course, controlling the China story. Everything that people say about China, China would like to shape and control that. But it's also about using all of this data to flow into machine learning and translation services, remembering that one of the big problems that China has in terms of being really successful in disinformation in other language markets is the difficulty of speaking outside the Mandarin world in many cases. But using a lot of this data to feed in to actually translation services so that their international communications are just a lot more kind of effective. That's just one example of the way that some of these really large state actors are using data, big data, and their massive data capabilities to try and essentially have the edge in influencing the global conversation in their direction. So I'll just leave it there for now.
Gulisa, what about Asia Pacific?
After hearing Anastasia, I feel like we're going to have a lot of overlaps. She provided a great overview of some of the important points. So, it would be great to build on one of the things that she said, just to be able to expand on that a bit. And that is influence for hire, because that's been receiving a lot more attention lately, and it's being seen as an increasing risk by platforms, scholars, as well as practitioners. So one of the main concerns is that influence for hire is making influence operations more accessible to smaller players, and it's making attribution a lot more difficult. And articles from organizations like SANS, the one that I'm in, as well as ASPI, where Anastasia in, as well as scholars from Jonathan Ong, Ross Tapsal, and others, have explored influence operations with examples from the region. For instance, Jonathan Ong looked at influence for hire, financially driven, professional influence for hire industry in the Philippines. ASPI report looked at examples from Indonesia, as well as content farms catering content to Taiwan. In my field work in Taiwan, during my interviews, several interviewees cited content farms as a growing concern. Content farms like, websites catering clickbait, murky content. And some of the interviewees also mentioned the use of intermediaries to disseminate information, which sort of like disconnect the content from the actual source. And there was one person I interviewed, as well as scholars like Puma Shen, who mentioned Malaysia connected content farms catching content to Taiwan. So that means there's production for domestic consumption, and there's also an international aspect when it comes to influence for hire. So it's a growing concern that will likely occupy us in the near future, but sadly, we still need more targeted solutions to resolve it. So let me leave it at that.
Mark?
I think just to push the point a little further from the other previous speakers, I think we see this cross-pollination of the human aspect and the technological advancements that we see, where we use troll farms and influence for hire and combine that with advanced technologies like deepfakes to sort of project this veneer of legitimacy. And we've seen this during the height of the COVID-19 in the case of China, but also in other aspects in the region. And so I think another sort of threat where we see information warfare and influence operations having a crossover is in the realm of cyber-enabled operations. And this is very critical, especially in the recent sort of election that happened in the Philippines, where we now see the crossover of international security and national elections at the ballot box. And so I think last year, just to refresh everyone's memory, Graphica conducted a research in tandem with Facebook, and they called this Operation Naval Gazing, where Facebook has taken down Chinese link accounts that promotes Sara Duterte and Imelda Marcos, who are essentially the Sara won the vice presidential bid in the recent election in the Philippines, and Amy Marcos is the sister of Bongbong Marcos. And so we see now China flexing its influence operations, whereby it used to be that advanced persistent threat actors are moving the needle in the South China Sea. But now we see this movement from China where it tries to influence elections to candidates that favor its position. And I think what we've seen in the past couple of months with what has happened in the Philippines is really this growing crossover between cyber-enabled operations and foreign interference, where we have an external power trying to flex their influence in the national security or sovereignty issue or electorate of a country like the Philippines. And I think just one final point, we often point our fingers towards, just a counterintuitive to the China sort of issue on influence operations. We also need to think about the growing role of tech giants. How do we keep these tech companies accountable? And how do states really exert power to control and curb their influence? I know here in the United States, we had a lot of movements on the antitrust investigation towards the monopoly of the big tech companies. But with the entry of Elon Musk buying Twitter, what does this mean with the greater technological ecosystem with regard to free speech? And also for us who work in the think tank industry conducting research. So I think I'll stop there and open to more comments from the other speakers.
Well, I'm really glad you brought up the issue of, foreign interference and what they might look like in the Philippines recent election, Mark. Maybe you could talk a bit more about that. And this is the second question I'd like to ask everyone is, what do foreign interference look like in your country or region that you've done study on? We'll start back with you, Mark.
So I think, like I've mentioned with in the Philippines case, this is really this growing sort of cross-pollination or, ASPI has done a great job of this reporting as well about this strategy of cross-posting, where there is a coordinated action between what is happening in Twitter and what is happening as well on Facebook and what's happening in YouTube. And I think to push the point further, and I've been watching TikTok, role increasingly in this space is that in the recent election in the Philippines, TikTok has been one of the most influential platforms, has a growing number of following in Southeast Asia, but also has a very much I'd say and argue less stringent rules on taking inauthentic, coordinated and inauthentic behavior vis-a-vis its counterparts such as Facebook, Twitter, and Google. And so this growing sort of conversation, not just here in the United States, but also in the region, and how much these tech giants like TikTok, which is obviously still debated with its ties with the Chinese Communist Party, in terms of the ByteDance as the parent company, has really sort of that relationship affects the algorithms that runs in these applications, but more so on how new areas of disinformation and fake news and influence for hire proliferate in this new and emerging ecosystem in this region.
Gulizar, what about Taiwan or other countries you've done study on?
Yeah, so let me try to provide a few examples based on Malaysia and Taiwan. And I think Taiwan is a great case in the sense that it does also show that it expands beyond the platforms. So platforms definitely are environments that we have to look at, but there are things that actually stretch beyond them as well. But let me just start with Malaysia, because when I tried to explore influence operations related debates in Malaysia before the 14th general elections, what was very palpable was the politicization of the fake news label and its use in political rivalry. And this was arguably overshadowing other perhaps deeper concerns related to influence operations in the country. And one of the things that came out of that observation was that there's a great need to review political communication practices, not only in Malaysia, but perhaps in other countries as well. As to Taiwan, during my interviews, the means of influence shared by interviewees included economic and diplomatic pressure, influence via traditional media, as well as use of social media in various ways to inject influence. Now, each of these dimensions have their own complexities within them. So for instance, I'm currently finalizing a working paper that also came out of that larger field work. And the paper is on the use of traditional media in influence operations in Taiwan. So some of the issues that interviewees see as rendering traditional media vulnerable to influence actually overlap with changes and challenges that arrived with the introduction of internet and the social media to newsrooms. These include industry pressures such as 24-hour news cycles, financial and human resource crunch, time pressure on fact-checking, reliance on social media for breaking information, as well as for quick content for the consumption of massive audiences. And these factors not only impact the news quality or take a toll on fact-checking, but also the need for resources, lack of funding, raise concerns about embedded advertising or the sources that are, funding media. Because against the lack of funds, dependence on embedded advertising as well as like non-ideal sourcing funds would likely increase. So in a way, the bigger picture is formed of many smaller pictures.
Yeah. What about Australia? We hear a lot in the news about foreign interference, but what do they really look like, Anastasia?
I think the ones that we heard, that the way that it burst on the scene is influence on politicians in Australia. So that's how there's a lot of investigative journalism done by people at Sydney Morning Herald and ABC and others. And that was really around a couple of mega donors who have fought court cases and won on defamation. So I have to be very careful what I say here. But basically, Chinese Communist Party or United Front linked Chinese businessmen who donated lots and lots of money, and across parties as well. And also who made a practice of hiring ex-politicians, into their own companies, and that there's a lot of speculation about foreign interference in that way. So foreign interference through direct foreign ownership of critical assets like ports, poles and wires, large tracts of agricultural land. So there's that aspect. So it's basically using the power of one's economy to buy up a bunch of critical infrastructure and then using that as potential leverage. again, buying off key members of political parties in terms of attempts. Now, I will say, and of course, the intelligence agencies have said that none of those attempts have succeeded. And certainly in the Australian context, we've seen the China discourse become much more sort of anti-China, much more frightened of China, much more aware than the other way around. I think it's a brave politician these days who says anything sort of pro-CCP or really pro-China. So that didn't happen. The other thing is in terms of Australia's China's diaspora. And this is, again, something the intelligence agencies have been looking at for a long time. So the idea of, of basically using your ethnic diaspora in a highly multicultural country and influencing them in particular directions. To the point of buying language media outlets and controlling them, flooding those zones with disinformation of all kinds. And these, to go to your point, is that these are often struggling media organisations with not a lot of money, so they're actually really easy to buy at influence. But it goes further than that to actual intimidation of members of the diaspora who might have a contrary position. Or an anti, say, China position or an anti-Russia position. But it's not just China and Russia that are getting into this stuff. Even much smaller countries are beginning to ape, those kinds of tactics. So the Rwandan community, for example, in Australia, is also having to deal with these kinds of, interferences in their own community life from the Rwandan elements of the Rwandan government. So it's I just wanted to quickly say it's a much bigger picture than China. I think the other thing is that yes, that intelligence community has also said that they have seen attempts to influence elections through disinformation practices, but often through, again, language, media, but also things like encrypted media channels, which are just really hard for the Electoral Commission and government to pick up on. So a lot of kind of hidden stuff that is kind of well known that it's there, but it's still really, really hard to do anything about. I will say one thing, and this is not an ASPI view, this is very much my own view, and that is that we need to be very, very concerned about countries like China in terms of the disinformation space here in Australia, but we also need to be concerned by other actors. And I think one of the things that's come up very recently is the anti-vaxxer movement and various other kinds of, conspiracist-based political movements that are very online driven. The genesis of those movements is not in China. It's in the United States. And it's a very difficult thing for Australia to talk about because the United States is such a close ally, obviously. But a lot of those vectors are based in, through what is it, a big, very big disinformation culture in the US as well. So I think we need to be cognizant of that.
Wonderful segue into Frank. What about foreign interferences in the US? What do they look like?
Yeah, that's one of those how much time do we have type questions. In the interest of time and not an entire separate section, I'll disinformation targeting domestic populations in the United States, I think it's fair to say, is an existential threat to the U.S. experiment. Now, much of that disinformation is domestically sourced, so the foreign interference aspects of it may be, depending on the issue and time, may be less damaging than the self-harm we do to ourselves. But there is and can be a foreign interference aspect, as the Mueller Report Volume 2, the 2016 U.S. election indicated. But it is an existential threat. The solutions are obviously challenging given desirable aspects of U.S. political culture, including freedom of speech. But I think it's fair to say that here, perhaps as with other aspects of cybersecurity, there has been a market failure and an undersupply of the public good of cybersecurity in the context of this aspect of information environments, as well as undersupply of other public goods ranging from education to, as was suggested earlier, news media in the public interest. So there are very few silver linings as far as I can say on this side of the Pacific.
So what has your government or the US government done to counter foreign interference in particular? And do you think what they have done or are doing is effective, is addressing the issue?
Effective, no. There is a steep learning curve. I think we're climbing it, but it's a competitive interaction, and so whether we're climbing it as fast as the problem, whether the threat actors are domestic or international, is a separate question and to be determined. Shifting the question a little bit in terms of from the standpoint of someone who works closely with the defense establishment in the US, which is externally focused, again, for better or for worse, the better parts being that the role of the US military in terms of domestic law enforcement security actions is mercifully constrained. So when we think in the DoD towards issues of how the US approaches information and influence operations overseas, I think we talk a good game about the global competition for influence, but short of war, our game plans, I think, leave a lot to be desired. For example, an outside observer could be forgiven for reading our naval strategy and wondering how American influence and competitive advantage are going to somehow automatically flow from our warships, aircraft, and submarines. Our ability to integrate the instruments of military hard power, if you will, with influence in information environments where most influence is generated is wanting, and the disconnect is dangerous. It undermines our ability to credibly communicate our military deterrent, but also our democratic values. And I think it's evident that several adversaries, state and non-state, as flagged importantly earlier, know this and exploit America's competitive disadvantage with some effect, again, below the threshold of armed conflict.
What about Australia, within Australia itself, Anastasia? How have we tried to counter foreign interference and whether or not they're working? And before you actually answer this question, I forgot to mention that this webinar is sponsored by the Department of Defense in Australia. But I'm sure many of them can't attend today's talk, but I'm sure they would appreciate a frank discussion on this.
Yeah, so from Australia's perspective, there's been a bunch of foreign interference legislation, and that's been around registering foreign agents, foreign influences, so that to try and make sure that there's no sort of under the table foreign lobbying that works against Australian interests. It's voluntary, so you can, it's not that effective really, but it is basically a symbol, I think, that that the government, put forward to say, okay, we're taking this seriously. There's the government has really tried to. There's a foreign interference task force, for example, that tries to pull together all the security agencies together to try and do something about this problem. But I think, as Frank said, so much of this problem happens in another space. So it happens in the commercial space. It happens in civil society. And that's something that governments, including the Australian government, have a really hard time in thinking about. Again, you think of the security services, they've traditionally thought about security in a particular way. It's pretty much like, tell me what to point at and, tell me what to shoot at, essentially. Very important, of course, skill to have. But in terms of this grey zone area, this area that is really playing in the social spaces of the country, that's something that Department of Defense, that is not really their role to reach in and try and do something about that. The Australian Electoral Commission itself, a very tiny organisation, very effective and has a lot of integrity. They've been trying to look at disinformation and foreign interference as well, but they have a tiny capacity. So they've been trying to partner with security organisations, but that's been difficult. It's really been difficult. They have this really tiny capacity. The intelligence agencies obviously have added a whole bunch of open source functions and have really been, very cognizant, very aware of this issue for a while. Very difficult, of course, to comment on exactly where that effort is inside the agencies as well. There's also been a lot of talk about if we're going to get into that information game. So say take a place like the Pacific, where we're worried about China's increasing influence. And China has an information operations game in the Pacific, in the Pacific Islands. If we're going to do that, what's the nature of that? Do we mirror those sorts of tactics? Do we become purveyors of disinformation and propaganda? Some, not in defence, but elsewhere in the broader academic community, have sort of posited, well, maybe we need to do that. Maybe we need to think more ruthlessly about that. Again, my own view is that a civil society response is better. But also that governments need to become better about telling their story, and that could be defined as propaganda. But in terms of like saying, who we are, what our values are, essentially what our value proposition to the region is. China's coming in and saying, we've got this whole worldview, we're not colonialist, arguable, the economic weight of the globe is with us, join with us and become, prosperous and successful. That's kind of their pitch to the region. What is our pitch to the region? I'm not sure that we have, a really effective one. So there is that sort of government strategic communication side. Then I think there's also, as I said before, this sort of public interest journalism side, which is just so important. We have traditionally, for the last at least 15 years, not supported public interest journalism in our region. We've taken away our own ABC broadcasting services. This is a soft power tool that, it's just ridiculous that we ever did that. But at the same time, local journalism and local voices need support in the Pacific as well. They're not going to get that from China. We should be supporting really good local journalism that holds governments to account and promotes democratic values and the strengths of those as well. So it's a really short way of saying governments can only do so much in terms of legislation, but because so many of these problems escape a legislative response, then we need to think much more creatively. And yes, and a lot of these problems escape a defence and national security approach as well. Unless you are talking about joining a sharp power disinformation game oneself. So I think I'll just probably leave it there.
I want to push you a little bit on this issue, Anastasia, because based on the recent white paper on information operations and foreign interference, it seems to me that defense had made up its mind that it will have to engage in some kind of influence operations themselves. Am I wrong about that?
No, I don't think so. It's all of that. A lot of that stuff is not in terms of the thinking and the background behind that thinking is very difficult to pass, because all of that is very highly classified conversations, shall we say. But there is a view, yes, as I've said, that is kind of the way to go. And again, it's a view that I completely disagree with in the broad, except for, there might be a specific, if you're already in a kinetic situation, in a war, and you need to use every, tool available, to defeat the enemy, to confuse the enemy, then I think, there's a case for, classic psyops and, disinformation propaganda. It was used to great effect in World War II to defeat the Nazis, for example, on a number of occasions. So there might be a case there, but as a general principle, I think it's really dangerous. I think if you live by the disinformation sword, you die by it. And I think I only need to look at places like Russia. in the beginning of Putin's reign, for example, he had really sophisticated ideas about manipulating and managing public opinion. Those sophisticated ideas have died off over time. And now that we see a country that is captured by its own disinformation in really critical ways, its current trajectory is one that is disastrous, that has, will really make Russia struggle as a country and struggle with its actual sovereignty, I think, for the next 3 or 4 decades. And I think, when you use disinformation, it starts off as, we'll put it over there, those fools over there will fall for that disinformation and be manipulated, but we'll know what's going on. We'll always have that separation. That separation begins to collapse pretty quickly when you start governing via disinformation or projecting power via disinformation. It's very difficult to begin to separate governing elites from the disinformation that they purvey. And you essentially, you see governments that self-radicalize in the end. So I think that's one of the reasons I think it's really, really dangerous. And the other thing that I think is really dangerous is trust is a really, really valuable geopolitical commodity right now. And I think that we see that again, sorry to use a Russia-Ukraine example, but when countries have come together to sanction Russia and do it very quickly, they're able to do that because there's a degree of trust in each other's systems and each other's motivations, and a shared worldview and values about human flourishing. I think that when you start to pump out disinformation and become part of that game yourself, you start to erode that really, really precious commodity of trust. And I don't think Australia should be getting into that game.
Fantastic. So let's shift this towards the Philippines. I think the Philippines is pretty much where all factors of influence operations live. It's like an ecosystem of influence operations. You've got, the industry, the click farms, you've got governments who have been and have proven to be engaging in disinformation against their own citizens. They're being also attacked by other types of foreign interference disinformation. So, Mark, give us a bit of a picture of what does the government think when they talk about foreign interference or information operations? What does it mean in the Philippines?
So I think in the last government, the vice president candidate, Kiko Pangilinan, filed a legislation to curb disinformation, fake news in the country, but that didn't fly. And I think across Southeast Asia, the Philippines is one of the country who hasn't really sort of thought through about a legal framework on how to counter disinformation and fake news. And, it fails in comparison with other countries such as Indonesia, Vietnam, and to some extent, correct me if I'm wrong, Malaysia. So as Anastasia, and also, building on Anastasia and Frank's assessment, I think there is this, and also as a Filipino living in the United States across Indo-PACOM, I would argue that governments often think about information operation from a very defense sort of oriented perspective. And I think in developing countries in Southeast Asia, and to some degree Taiwan as well, I think there is a growing sort of cognizance that rather than looking at foreign interference from a defense perspective, there is a growing resilience perspective that is on the horizon. And I give you an example of this. The bad news is, yes, the Philippines has become this role model of disinformation and fake news, but also there are a lot of coalitions of civil society and academics bonding together to really counter disinformation. And we have, for instance, this coalition called Check.ph, university professors who are really working 24/7 to counter disinformation, particularly at the height of the election. To cross over to our neighbor in Taiwan, we have COFAX. COFAX is a very lively civil society that often lives in Line. Line is an app, a messaging app famous in Thailand and also in other parts in Southeast Asia, where it's really a community-driven approach to correct lies and disinformation and fake news. And often in my conversation with Audrey Tang, which is the digital minister in Taiwan, you would always say that they're aiming for a nerd immunity. It's not a herd immunity, but a nerd immunity where every individual or people in the community are aware of fake news. And in the Philippines, that's very much not the case because it's obvious that democracy in Southeast Asia is really backsliding, but more so the level of education and critical awareness. And I think this is where the conversation where Australia and the other allies and partners across the region, even the United States, comes to the big picture when thinking about overseas development aid. Where do we put our money in terms of supporting communities, building resilience towards fake news? And so I think, again, to Anastasia's word, what is the narrative that we also put forward out there to counter this disinformation that will fuel foreign policy and public policies across the region?
I love the nerd immunity response, Mark. Gulisar, you've done work in Taiwan, which is often the first case we think of when we think of foreign interference in the Asia Pacific. What are your thoughts?
Frankly, from Taiwan, I think one of the learning points is definitely from the civic tech community. They're so engaged and the government is cooperating with them. And then even during COVID-19, the way that they try to involve civic tech community in combating potential disinformation before it even comes out, like, about the masks, for instance, was really exemplary. And then perhaps it can provide an example for the countries in the region as well. But having said that, of course, like to be able to adapt it to your context, you also have to have, the groundwork for it, tech-savvy population, and as well as like government willing to cooperate with a civic tech environment and then a vibrant civic tech culture to begin with. But perhaps another way that I can contribute to the discussion, because like we've heard of so many specific examples from the region, but there has been a number of reports that have been published in the last couple of years that try to provide a bird's eye view of some of the steps that have been taken by the government. So perhaps as the last speaker, maybe I can take a step back and try to provide what these reports say on the countermeasures that have been implemented so far. We at SANS attempted at listing some future considerations as well, so I can also share that with you. So in a report that we published 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, 2020, the report was actually based on, it was a follow-up to a foreign interference report that we published previously, and then building on that, we tried to come up with some considerations to take against foreign interference. So in that report, we proposed 5 considerations: understanding adversaries' goals, evaluating and defending entities' vulnerabilities, having clear goals for countermeasures, building task forces, and responding to specific tactics when necessary. Now, these are really high-level considerations for future based on current threats. But as I mentioned, in the past few years, there emerged multiple studies that try to look at countermeasures as a whole, especially with regards to influence operations. We attempted at that as well quite a few years ago, but a lot has changed since then. So if you look at existing global responses, one of the recent works that came out was by Wilmer, who tried to group it under 5 measures. And those 5 measures, we see examples from the region as well. One is changes in organizational design, like having either task forces or new organizations within government to respond to influence operations related problems. So an example could be, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, because it's an example from Australia. An example could be the task force that Australia has for the elections. Then another one is parliamentary hearings. From the region, Singapore had hearings on deliberate online falsehoods, which I and a few of my colleagues participated in. And if I'm not mistaken, Australia had hearings on foreign interference. Then another one is legislation, which also others have touched on. But perhaps one thing that is important to note is that legislations are not uniform across countries, and they target diverse aspects of influence operations. They may be targeting advertising, they may be targeting elections, they may be targeting disinformation specifically. For instance, Singapore passed Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act in 2019. Another countermeasure concerns public awareness raising oriented initiatives. Quite a number of them are geared towards media literacy. But we can also speak of conferences, publications, roundtables that are happening more and more in the region. And then there are, of course, more acute measures like internet controls or shutdowns, which at times expand beyond the internet as well to news media or mobile and TV broadcasting as well. One known example is from India when they had a shutdown in Jammu and Kashmir. So there are a wide variety of countermeasures that are being tried at the moment. It's a multi-layered problem. One solution can definitely not fix it, but perhaps one thing that is missing at the moment is a look into how effective these countermeasures are.
Well, thanks, Gulizar. That's an excellent summary of existing countermeasures. And you're absolutely right that we're still working through whether they actually work or not. So let's move on to the Q&A. We have our first question from John Tan. Is there a risk that when an agency conducts information ops, it may inadvertently affect the course of domestic politics by favoring one party? If there is a risk, can this risk be minimized? Since this weekend we have an election in Australia, shall we start with Australia's response, Anastasia?
It's really difficult to speak in an Australian context because presumably, if one of our intelligence services did conduct an information operation, we wouldn't necessarily really know about it or be able to identify it. So that's difficult. You can only really look at other countries that have done that. I think there's one point here. If you look at the web of disinformation around the world, it's not just each country doing its own thing. They learn from each other. So Russia learns from disinformation networks in the US and vice versa. China's in a constant learning mode, looking at some of these big disinformation actors and refining their own tactics. And just to kind of repeat a point that I was trying to make before, when you do that, when there's this kind of global self-reinforcing ecosystem of disinformation, absolutely it has crossover effects into domestic politics, both in the content, what people find important in domestic politics. So in Russia, again, sorry to use the example again, but it's what I'm working on at the moment. Before the Ukraine invasion, public polling, and there's so much public polling in Russia, was finding that economic issues was the key thing for most of the general public. Very soon, after a massive propaganda effort by the Russian government, of course, glorious victory in Ukraine was the number one public issue. And not only that, public discourse, all the sort of kind of technocratic economic concerns just went out of public discourse. And public discourse in Russia is now full of incredibly conspiracist kinds of thinking. The way that Russia is throwing around nuclear and WMD threats, for example, is something I've actually never seen before, except with the exception of perhaps North Korea. So it changes both the content and the tone of public debate. So yes, it's possible. I don't know if that answers your question. Sorry.
It's all right. I think this goes back to one of the questions that I was hoping to ask everybody was, what are some of the good tips that we could learn from other nations, with particular example for Australia, that we could engage in that also help us or help Australia build its own legitimacy in the region. Mark, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I think before I answer that question directly, I wanted to preface my response by saying that it is very imperative that when we talk about information influence operations or foreign interference, especially from the context of capable state actors like China, that it is a wholesale game. And what I say about a wholesale game is it's not just about spreading disinformation online. Take the case of the Solomon Islands and the Pacific Islands vis-a-vis Southeast Asia. China is, of course, supporting these trolls, this influence for her, but also they're backing it up with economic incentives, with infrastructure, with 5G and Huawei. So if we are just thinking about foreign interference as this very siloed kind of phenomenon, definitely will not be able to deliver a holistic sort of approach. So I think what I could offer in terms of what the Australian Department of Defense could learn from the experiences, at least from the different perspectives of the United States, Taiwan, and the rest of the Asia Pacific, is I think first and foremost is that revisiting crisis management. And this is very much a fact of practical considerations in terms of when you have deep fakes, when you have this digital forgery that goes around that Biden is going to flash in your YouTube channel, that the US is going to launch its nuclear attack on North Korea. How do we establish crisis communication with our partners and allies, but also with other countries that we disagree with, like China, and also to some extent Russia? I think in this day and age where information really is, swirling not just in secured platforms, but also public foreign policies are being announced in Twitter, I think crisis communication is something that Pentagon and the Australian Defence in Canberra should revisit. I think the second item that I also sort of more practical consideration is cybersecurity. We've been conducting in Pacific Forum in collaboration with colleagues of Frank and the US Naval War College. We've been conducting cybersecurity tabletop exercises. And these exercises are very practical for us to revisit doctrines and capabilities that allies and partners often need to revisit in this changing environment of geopolitical competition. And so I think third recommendation I'd say is really, let's have the tech giants in these conversations. Because at the end of the day, as we see in the Ukraine-Russia war, tech giants are acting on ad hoc policies. Their public policy team in Washington, D.C. and Asia Pacific are running around reconciling the demands that the West is to curtail the spread of Russian disinformation. They now find themselves in a very difficult position that, yes, indeed, information warfare is happening in their field, but where are they in this conversation? And so I think as much as we want accountability from them, we also would want to have more transparency from them, because at the end of the day, we will just be running around because these tech giants in Silicon Valley hold the keys to the kingdom. And so I think for us to really have that constructive and holistic strategy, that's really going to be the meeting of the minds of every individual. So I'll stop there.
That's an excellent point, Mark, about looking at foreign interference and information ops as a part of a much bigger issue, and therefore we're not blindsided when these types of incidents occur. Any more? I think we have time for one more question. Any more question from the audience? If not, I would really like to thank the Center for International Security Studies for hosting this event, the Department of Defense of Australia for funding this event, and I'm hoping that this will be one of many conversations we'll have in the region, in the Asia Pacific region, about the important issues of information operations and foreign interferences, and that we could provide thoughts for how we could advance our knowledge and understanding of these issues further, both in academia, in research community, in policy ground, and also to the general public. Thank you very much for your collaboration today and for presenting your talks and thoughts, Frank, Mark, Gulizar, and Anastasia. Appreciate your time, and for the CIS team for making this event happen. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thanks.
Thank you.